You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On a blustery November morning in 2007, a medical investigator from the Minnesota Department of Health inspected the slaughterhouse floor of a pork processing plant. She was there to investigate a troubling outbreak. Over the past year, multiple employees had suffered severe nerve damage. It was so bad that some of them had even been paralyzed, and so far, nobody knew what was causing it. As the plant's CEO showed the investigator around, she carefully examined every step of the processing line, and she couldn't believe how quickly the dead pigs were broken down into various cuts of meat. The employees barely had time to finish their tasks before a new pig arrived in front of them. But otherwise, the investigator thought that everything else seemed to be clean and orderly. That was, until she saw something so horrifying it made her stop in her tracks. She had never seen something so gruesome, so barbaric, so unsanitary in her whole life. And if her suspicions were right, this was the reason behind the dangerous outbreak. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button to join your hacky sack circle, but instead of serving them the hacky sack, just throw them a live tarantula. This episode is called The Mist. On December 10th, 2006, a slight man in his 20s with thick black hair stood shivering as he worked on the slaughterhouse floor at Quality Pork Processors in Austin, Minnesota. Machinery clanked in the background, and the metallic smell of fresh blood and acrid bleach hung in the air. The man, whose name was Javier, felt the freezing wind blow in from the loading docks and seep through the thin white lab coat he wore over his clothes. But Javier wasn't just cold. His muscles ached. He felt like he might have a fever, and his hands and feet tingled as if they were asleep. He hoped he wasn't coming down with the flu. He stomped his feet and tried to shake the tingling sensation out of his hands, but that didn't help. Javier's workstation was the last stop on a conveyor line that snaked its way through a large room. On this line, workers systematically carved up each hog carcass into roughly 150 pounds of pork, sausage, bacon, and other cuts of meat. Javier stood shoulder to shoulder at a long table with two other workers. A young woman named Maria was to his right, and on his left was an older man named Carlos. And the three of them, their job was to process the pigs' heads. All three of them wore rubber boots and safety glasses, and their lab coats were pretty much always stained with blood and gore. Maria and Carlos looked up as Javier kept stomping his feet, but they quickly forgot about him and returned their attention to the work in front of them. A new pig head came down the line about every 3 seconds, and there really wasn't time to make conversation. Javier had started this job 3 months earlier after moving all the way from Oaxaca, Mexico. Someone he knew from his hometown had moved here to Austin, Minnesota first, and then sent word back home to Mexico saying there were lots of good jobs here. And so, the town of Austin, Minnesota had now filled up with friends and relatives from the same area in Mexico. Javier and his wife, Anna, had decided to take a risk and follow all these people going to Minnesota. They'd packed up their entire lives and brought their 2 young kids. The freezing winter was a huge adjustment, and it was hard to be in a place where they didn't speak the same language. But Javier was learning English as quickly as he could, and for now he was lucky that most of his coworkers were Latino as well, so he could speak Spanish at work. And so Javier and Anna were quickly becoming part of a tight-knit Mexican community in Minnesota. Javier, who loved basketball, had even found a few friends to play pickup games with on the weekends when it was warm enough outside. And so all in all, Javier was happy with his new life in Minnesota. He was glad to have his job at the meatpacking plant, even though it was totally physically punishing. Everyone on the processing line did the same thing over and over and over again all day long. Javier knew that many of his coworkers suffered from repetitive motion injuries, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, which causes numbness, tingling, and pain in the hand and forearm. But on that cold December day, Javier tried not to focus on his aching, tingling limbs. There was a nurse on duty at the plant, but he didn't want to risk being sent home. He didn't have many sick days left, and he really needed the paycheck. His family needed winter clothes, and their expenses were much higher in Austin, Minnesota than they had been back in Mexico. So despite how horrible he felt, Javier remained in his place between Maria and Carlos at the end of the processing line. He turned his attention to the work in front of him and finished his shift before heading home. The next day, Javier woke up in his apartment, shivering under his blanket. Before he even opened his eyes, he realized that he still felt achy and his hands were still very tingly. And it was an odd sensation in his hands, almost like his hands belonged to someone else. As Javier pulled the blanket closer to his body, he immediately felt that same feverish chill that he'd had the previous day at the plant. Javier desperately just wanted to go back to sleep, but he knew he couldn't. He had to go to work. Javier finally opened his eyes and tried to swing his legs towards the edge of the bed, but nothing happened. His legs remained still. He tried to tense the muscles, but felt no response. With his heart racing, he sat up and grabbed at his thighs with his hands, and to Javier's horror, they just felt like dead weight. No matter what he did, he couldn't get his legs to move. Javier frantically yelled out that he couldn't feel his legs. His wife, Anna, rushed inside with a look of deep concern on her face. Cold sweat started dripping from Javier's brow as the realization of his situation sunk in. He told Anna that he needed to go to the hospital right now. The couple didn't have a car, so Anna called a taxi, and then she and their kids literally carried Javier from his bed to the cab. Javier did his best to keep a brave face on for his family, but when he looked over at his wife, he could tell how scared she was. When Javier and Anna arrived at the Austin Medical Center, which was just a few miles from their apartment, medical technicians lifted Javier onto a gurney and wheeled him into an exam room. A few minutes later, a doctor entered the room, followed by an interpreter who greeted Javier in Spanish and said her name was Carol. For the next few minutes, the doctor and Javier discussed his symptoms as Carol translated their statements. Finally, the doctor said something to Carol, and then the doctor left the room. Javier could hear him making a phone call from his office across the hallway. Carol leaned into Javier and explained that the doctor suspected that Javier had nerve damage, but he didn't know what had caused it, and the Austin Medical Center was not really equipped to treat it. The doctor had recommended that Javier be transferred to the Mayo Clinic, a larger medical center about 50 miles away in Rochester, Minnesota. He was making those arrangements now. Javier looked over at Anna as she squeezed his hand. He didn't want to go so far away from her and the kids, but he needed to get better so he could go back to work. Javier looked back at Carol and nodded. He would go to the Mayo Clinic. Two weeks later, Javier lay in a hospital bed at the Mayo Clinic, looking out the window at the falling snow. It was Christmas Day, and Javier wished he could be home celebrating with his family. He had spent the past 2 weeks having countless blood tests, being rolled in and out of MRI machines, and feeling needle pokes at his veins. But he didn't feel much better, and he still couldn't move his legs. The doctors explained that his spinal cord was severely inflamed, which was causing his symptoms. However, the doctors said that they still had no idea why, except that it had to do with Javier's own immune system. For some reason, it was attacking his own nerves instead of helping to keep him healthy. A nurse walked into the room and checked Javier's IV drip. Javier was being treated with steroids, which are powerful chemicals that reduce swelling in the human body. His doctors had promised Javier that steroids would bring some relief to his spinal cord, although they probably would not completely cure his mysterious ailment. Javier winced as he remembered the doctor who told him that he might spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. The thought of that filled Javier with dread. If he couldn't walk, then he would not be able to keep working at the meat processing plant. He would have no way to make a living for Anna and the kids, and he would become dead weight to his whole family. Javier thought that he and Anna had come too far and worked too hard to give up now. And so he looked down at his tingling legs, and with all his might, he tried to move them, and just then he saw he could wiggle his toes. Just a little. Wasn't much, but it was a start. Javier decided he would do everything he could to try to get back on his feet. As Javier was struggling to recover, Carol Hidalgo, the translator at the Austin Medical Center, walked into a small exam room with a doctor to help out a new patient. It was early in the spring of 2007, about 4 months after Javier had first been hospitalized, and Carol was always extremely busy. This area had a lot of Spanish-speaking residents, so she was constantly translating for the hospital's medical staff. It was tiring work, but Carol enjoyed it. She felt like she was a problem solver. The latest patient was a tired-looking man in his 40s who worked at the quality pork processors plant with Javier. The man, whose name was Carlos, the man who stood next to Javier on the processing line, rubbed his legs as he explained that he'd been feeling weak and experiencing tingling in his limbs for over a month now. Carol listened carefully and relayed his symptoms to the doctor. Carlos said that his right hip and thigh were throbbing, and it was as if the soles of his feet were on fire. At first, he thought he was just tired from standing all day long, but now he was having trouble walking. Carlos said that he barely had the energy to do his job, but he desperately needed the money. His family's trailer home had burned down in the winter, and he was putting in extra hours to try to afford the rent on their new home. Carol's heart broke for him. She saw a lot of patients like Carlos. They worked so hard in order to make a better life for their families, but it was often at their body's expense. Their bodies often broke down as a result of the grueling work. She translated his story for the doctor, who nodded and told Carol to let Carlos know she was going to examine his legs. And when she was done, she shook her head and said that she'd need to run more tests. Carlos's muscles seemed fine, and so the doctor suspected that his problems were actually a nerve issue. As the doctor was speaking, Carol frowned. Something about this sounded familiar, but she couldn't exactly place what it was. And anyways, she saw so many patients every single day that it really wasn't that surprising that people's symptoms kind of bleeded together and sounded similar. So Carol jotted down some notes, and then she shook Carlos's hand and told him she hoped that he would feel better soon. Carol followed the doctor out of the room. Austin Medical Center was very crowded that day, and Carol had another patient that she needed to help. In May of 2007, so about 5 months after Javier first got sick, Javier proudly walked back through the quality pork processors plant doors with a huge smile on his face. For months, his family had survived on their tiny savings and the charity of friends and neighbors. His doctors still didn't know what had made him sick, but the steroid treatments had reduced the inflammation in his spinal cord, and with intense and very painful physical therapy, Javier had slowly learned to walk again, even though he did still need a cane for balance. But his doctors thought he was well enough to work again, and the plant had cleared him to come back. Javier yelled greetings to his co-workers, Maria and Carlos, over the very noisy machinery, and right away Javier noticed that they both looked very tired and were moving so stiffly. But there really wasn't time to talk. It was time to get back to work. Javier was the happiest he'd been since that horrible day in December when he first got sick. But despite the progress he had made, Javier still was not fully healed. While he had regained control of his legs, he had not regained control of his bladder. So he had to wear a catheter, a tube that collected his urine in a bag. The bag was taped to his leg under his pants, so it wouldn't be noticeable to anyone. Javier took a deep breath, stepped up to his old place in the assembly line, and got back to work. 3 weeks later, Javier sat on a bench outside the factory during his lunch break, resting in the sun. Since he had come back to work, the pain in his legs had returned. He knew his body wasn't as strong as it used to be, and he hoped it was just part of the healing process. As Javier tried to relax, Maria, the woman who worked with him on the processing line, walked over and eased down next to him. She groaned and rubbed her legs. She told Javier she had a knot in her calf that just wouldn't go away, and her arms were feeling so heavy. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she told Javier that her arms were so sore she could barely hold up the spoon to feed her baby daughter when she was at home. She said their colleague, Carlos, was struggling too, but he was trying to work through the pain. Suddenly, a whistle blew, which meant the lunch break was over. Javier watched as Maria slowly stood up and stretched, and then Javier tried to get up too, but suddenly his legs gave out from under him. He tried to stand up again, but his legs just wouldn't move. Javier told Maria to please go get help. He needed a doctor immediately. 3 months later, in September of 2007, Carol, the translator at Austin Medical Center, was in the emergency room helping a young woman named Maria. the same Maria who worked next to Javier at the QPP processing plant. Carol couldn't believe that Maria was sitting in a wheelchair. Just a few months earlier, she'd seen the young mother for another exam, and she seemed fine. Now, Maria could hardly stand up and needed help to get on the exam table, and when she tried to sign an authorization form, she couldn't even hold the pen. Maria said that it felt like her right arm had fallen asleep, and her feet were completely numb and tingling. A doctor came into the room and performed an examination. He tested Maria's reflexes and then arranged for additional blood tests. Then he had Carol tell Maria that he did have a diagnosis. Maria had a condition called neuropathy, which is a general term for nerve damage. It explained her weakness, numbness, and pain. He didn't know what was causing it, but he was still prescribing her steroids. After the doctor left, Carol, the translator, could see that Maria seemed unsure what to do. In a quiet voice, Maria told Carol that she was scared. A lot of her colleagues were getting sick too. One of them had even lost movement of his legs twice. Carol gave her a hug and promised her that the doctors would find an answer. Then she helped Maria back into her wheelchair and wheeled her to the elevator. After Maria left, Carol returned to the treatment area, deep in thought. Carol liked to write while she puzzled things out in her head. She sat in a chair and took out her notebook and a pen, and she watched people rush by in the hallway. She realized that she had translated for several patients over the past few months who all had very similar symptoms. There was Maria, who just a few months ago was walking but now could barely move, and then there was Carlos, whose feet felt like they were burning, and then there was Javier, whose legs had stopped working altogether. She scribbled down the first thing that they had in common. They had all been diagnosed with a type of neuropathy. And so Carol wondered if maybe something else connected these patients. Carol knew that each of these patients had different doctors and nurses, and these doctors and nurses rarely talked about their patients to each other. As a translator, Carol might be the only person in the clinic who knew that these patients had been diagnosed with the same problems. Just then, Carol spotted the chair of general medicine, Dr. Richard Schindler, walk by in the hallway. Carol knew he valued the opinions of everyone on his staff. He always found the time to talk. Carol ran after him and asked if he had a moment to chat. He nodded and said that he did. Then Carol took a breath and she asked him, "What causes neuropathy?" Carol had heard the diagnosis before, but she'd never quite understood it. He smiled at her and said that one of the most common causes of neuropathy was diabetes. Carol shook her head. She knew that Javier didn't have diabetes, and neither did Carlos or Maria. Dr. Schindler then told her that neuropathy can also result from traumatic injuries, exposure to toxins, and from infections. Dr. Schindler asked Carol why she was interested, and she told him that she'd translated for at least 3 patients who were all diagnosed with neuropathy. Carol was almost certain they all worked at the same pork processing plant. She thought there might be more she had forgotten about, but she needed his help to get a better understanding of their diagnosis. Dr. Schindler's expression grew thoughtful, and he told Carol to please find him later and he would help her try to figure it out. And so, later that afternoon, Carol and Dr. Schindler sat down together and went over the files of every patient that had been diagnosed with neuropathy in the past year. Carol could see Dr. Schindler's face grow anxious as they sifted through the names and charts. By the end of the day, he and Carol had identified 6 different cases of neuropathy that all seemed to be linked. Not only did they all work at quality pork processors, but they all worked in the same area of the processing line. Dr. Schindler thanked Carol for paying such close attention to the patients, and Carol told him that all she wanted was to figure out what was making them sick. She saw firsthand how much their jobs meant to them and their families. Carol just hoped that there was still time to help them before they became permanently paralyzed or worse. The next morning, after going through the patient files, Dr. Schindler picked up the phone to call the pork processing plant. He reached the factory's nurse and introduced himself and then explained the situation. He said several workers from her plant who were suffering from neuropathy had come to his clinic to be treated, and so now he needed to know if maybe other people who worked at this plant had maybe come to her with the same symptoms. He could hear the nurse pause for a moment, and then she said that she did remember some workers coming to her with tingling and soreness in their limbs, and she gave Dr. Schindler their names. He added them to the list of patients that he and Carol had already identified, making a total of more than 11 workers from this plant who all had similar symptoms. Dr. Schindler thanked the nurse for her help, and then they hung up. Clearly, there was something wrong at this pork processing plant, but the doctor didn't know what it was. He wondered if maybe workers were reacting to a vaccination, or maybe they had an infectious illness, or they'd been exposed to neurotoxic chemicals. He didn't know, but there was something there. Something was going on at this plant. Dr. Schindler realized that this could quickly turn into a huge medical investigation, one beyond the scope of just a small regional facility like the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center. And so the doctor sent out an email to Mayo Clinic, a much bigger clinic, which was where Javier had been treated. It was one of the best medical facilities in the state, and if anyone could help with this investigation that was about to start, it was them. Doctors at the Mayo Clinic quickly brought all 11 affected workers into their clinic one by one to test them for a long list of diseases and disorders. But all of the tests proved to be negative. Dr. Schindler reviewed the results with a growing sense of frustration. Within just a few months, these once healthy workers now had to use wheelchairs or had lost sensation in their arms, legs, or hands. It couldn't be a simple muscular disorder like carpal tunnel syndrome or any other repetitive stress injury. It wasn't a reaction to a vaccination, cancer, or a virus. It also was not a bacteria or a parasite. There had to be something happening at the pork processing plant, but no one at the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center or the Mayo Clinic could figure it out. Dr. Schindler realized that if he was going to get to the bottom of why people who worked at this plant were getting so sick, he would need more help. It was time to call the Minnesota Department of Health. On November 28, 2007, around 2 months after Carol, the interpreter, realized that something at the plant was making all these people sick, Dr. Ruth Linfield, the Minnesota state epidemiologist, pulled her car into Quality Pork Processing's parking lot. At the same time, several other cars drove into the lot and parked right next to her. Dr. Linfield was there to lead an inspection of the meat processing line. She'd brought with her a delegation of 3 animal health experts, a medical detective, an infection control specialist, and a toxicologist. Whatever was causing the workers at this plant to get sick, Dr. Linfield and her team were confident they would figure out what it was. The company's CEO, a man named Kelly Wadding, along with the head of HR and the company nurse, stepped forward to greet their visitors and lead them into the factory. Dr. Linfield stepped into the entry with the rest of the team, and she pulled protective gear over her dark gray business suit. Plastic gloves, booties, masks, and plastic gowns. Then she followed the CEO, Kelly Wadding, out onto the factory floor, and the inspection began. First, the investigators were escorted through the entry room, where enormous pigs weighing about 250 pounds were stunned and then slaughtered. After the pigs were slaughtered, their blood was drained and their carcasses were thoroughly cleaned. From the entry room, the group moved into the section called the warm room, where the carcasses were hung by their rear legs and butchered into different parts. As the investigators followed the path of the pig carcasses around the warm room, Dr. Linfield and her team observed the tasks being performed at each workstation. Each worker made a particular cut in the hog carcass. Some used machinery, and others used large knives. It was messy and repetitive, but so far, Dr. Linfield hadn't seen anything that could cause an outbreak of disease. Finally, at a section near the end of the line, the group came to a large table. About 35 workers were gathered there, removing the last bit of meat from the hog using a specialized device. A pink mist hung over the table. Dr. Linfield stopped walking and looked down at her plastic white gown. She could see all these tiny pink particles settling on her arms, chest, and shoulders. Then she looked back at the assembly line and was horrified by what she was seeing. And within minutes, the company's CEO, Kelly Wadding, had shut the entire plant down. Dr. Linfield was looking at what quality pork processors called the head table, where workers literally took apart the pig's head piece by piece. They cut out the snout, the ears, tongues, cheeks, and jaws of each hog using knives, chisels, and automatic cutting tools. But the part of the process that horrified Dr. Linfield was the very last step, when workers removed the pig's brain. Like the rest of the pig's body, its brain is a marketable product. People in some parts of the world will use pig brain to thicken their stir-fry, while other people scramble pig brain in with eggs. But because the plant processed the pigs so rapidly, the plant needed an efficient, easy way to extract the brains from the pigs' skulls. They came up with a unique method to get the brain out, which only a few other factories in the world had even tried. Under the company's unusual process, the brain removal workers were required to blast pressurized air into a hole in the pig's skull. And then the brain poured out of that same hole the air went in, now a gooey pink substance that kind of resembled Pepto-Bismol or a lumpy strawberry milkshake. And workers were blasting pig brains at an incredible speed, liquefying about 22 brains every minute. It was a gruesome process, to be sure, but what caught Dr. Linfield's attention was something else. It was the pink mist that hovered around the whole head table and then lightly coated the rest of the room thanks to the air currents from the fan above them. That pink mist was created by tiny particles of pig brain. The air gun that workers used to liquefy the brain was so strong that some of the brain became vaporized and basically floated up into the air. None of the workers wore any kind of breathing protection, such as respirators or face masks, so everyone in the room, but especially those who worked at the head table, and even more so the actual brain removal workers, were inhaling particles from 1,350 aerosolized pig brains every hour. Javier was a brain removal worker, and Carlos and Maria worked very close to his station. In fact, almost all the workers who got sick were stationed right near the brain removal machine. Dr. Linfield's team discovered that all of these workers were suffering from a brand new disease, which was given the name progressive inflammatory neuropathy. As a result of their massive exposure to aerosolized pig brain matter, their immune systems were constantly creating antibodies to neutralize the foreign proteins. But because these animal cells were very similar to human cells, the antibodies ended up attacking their own nerve cells as well, and over time, the disease could do enough damage to leave victims confined to a wheelchair. Kelly Wadding, the pork processing CEO, shut off the air gun as soon as Dr. Linfield pointed out all the pig brain particles floating in the air all around his employees. And then the CEO had that air gun hauled out of the factory on a trolley, never to return. And once that air gun was gone and the factory resumed work, the workers at the head table stopped getting sick. Javier would return to work a second time, but his body was so damaged that he could not actually handle the physical demands of the job. Javier's current state of health, the condition of his family, and his location are unknown. The same can be said for his co-workers, Maria and Carlos. As for the plant, they continue to process pork, slaughtering about 19,000 hogs every day. Owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop, and it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it, and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car, and as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks, and so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it. And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, why can't you open it? And the woman just says, we never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box. Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away, and he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks of hair. There was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it. And there was also a small wine goblet that was inside. And that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake. And these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops. And she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her and she turns around, and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up, and to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident. And now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things. And Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. And he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor, there's no damage anywhere, and he yells for Jane, there's no answer from Jane, and he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back, and he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore, and he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was gonna have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's gonna take a flashlight and he's gonna explore the basement, because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time, he's thinking to himself, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box, and he sets it down on a table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. And he goes to the back of the store to answer the call while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over, and she can't move, and she can't talk. And Kevin sees this happening. He runs over, and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911. And as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, because her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, that he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking, and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances, because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement, and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store, and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store, and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open, and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box, and there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out, because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store, so he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing, and she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him, and when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse, and she raises her hands up in front of her, and then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream, and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily. He's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom, and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real. And so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package. He eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table. And just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? This smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box. And he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen. And Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb, and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping, and so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep. And so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decide we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box, and when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday, so he puts the package in his truck and he goes upstairs and he works for the day, and then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his blacklight out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box, and he pops off the lock, and he gets ready, and he opens the doors, and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open, and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up, and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in, and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing. And his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool. But they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing, and their IT department comes up, and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick, and they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly.
Het is groen, de dagen zijn lang, de nachten zijn zo zoet. Als de zomer komt, voel ik me vrij. Het leven is mooi zo dichtbij. We dansen in het licht van de maan. Laat de zomer nooit meer weggaan. De rivier stroomt, het water is zo koel. De kinderen spelen, duiken in het poel. De geur van bloemen, het geluid van de wind. Elke dag een avond.
And he can't move his body, he can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door's open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye. And because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream. You're fine. And he's shaken up. You know, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes, or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, what happened to you? And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, "Hey Dad, who is that?" And he looks over at his son and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, "You just saw that too?" And he's like, "Yeah, who was that?" And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, "We have to leave the house right now." His wife comes downstairs and she's like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car." And so his wife sees how serious Jason is and she says, "Okay." And they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back, it's still locked in the back of the truck, and he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in, and he was going to put it in the basement, and it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it, because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself and he says, "Hey, I was here not too long ago and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it." And the woman reacted and she's like, "I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it." And Kevin's like, "Actually, yeah, I did open it." And he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she had stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work, and they said the chain would go rigid and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, "Release me, release me, release me." Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, they would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box, and that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, "What do we do? We've already opened it up." And she said, "You need to contact a rabbi." And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003, and apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments section and tell us where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly at the solar eclipse and be totally safe. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In 2012, a teenager in Minnesota opened her eyes from a deep sleep. One of the last things she remembered was feeling sick at a volleyball practice. Now she saw that she was lying in a bed in a small, crowded room. She heard piercing tones and beeps coming from something on her right side. She tried to sit up and realized that she could barely move. In fact, it took all of her strength just to lift her head and look down toward her feet. She was shocked at what she saw. Narrow plastic tubes and white wires were piled like spaghetti all around her. As she moved, she felt a pulling sensation, and she realized that all these tubes and wires were attached to her body. And then she saw that they all led to one place, a massive machine the size of a refrigerator sitting on the right side of her bed. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw someone come into the room. It was her mother, and her eyes were filled with tears. She took her daughter's hand and explained that the giant machine to the right of her was breathing for her. It was keeping her alive, and she might need it for the rest of her life. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, the next time the follow button is asleep, please decorate their car papier-mâché style. This episode is called Breathless. It was the first day of school in September of 2012, and a 16-year-old girl named Emma stood at her locker in the tiny town of Thief River Falls, Minnesota. She had volleyball practice next, so she threw a water bottle, a deodorant stick, hair ties, and a few other items into her backpack. Emma was excited that summer was over and they were back in school, but really just because she was excited about sports, not so much for her classes. She had made the varsity volleyball team, and now she was anxious to get on the court with her teammates. Emma looked in the tiny mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door, and immediately she grimaced at her reflection. She touched up her eyeliner and pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail. Her acne was flaring up again, even though she was taking medication for it, so she put on some concealer to cover it up. Then she threw the makeup into her backpack and shut her locker. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the noisy school gymnasium and dropped her backpack behind the bleachers. She could hear the familiar squeaking of sneakers and the smacking of volleyballs as her friends warmed up for practice. Emma felt right at home as she ran out to join them. But about halfway through the practice, Emma began to feel really tired. And not the normal kind of tired from like working out or running around. Her feet felt really heavy and her heart was pounding. When she looked around, she saw her teammates did not seem tired, so Emma just pushed herself and continued running all the drills. But after a few more minutes, she felt so winded that she just had to stop. And so her teammates rushed past her as Emma knelt down on one knee to catch her breath. Emma was used to feeling very fit and strong, but now her chest felt tight and she could barely breathe. She staggered to her feet and stumbled over to the bleachers. Emma's head felt heavy as she held it in her hands. She felt a sharp pain in her throat every time she swallowed, and now she was starting to feel scared. Her coach walked over and asked Emma if she was okay. Emma silently shook her head no. Her coach placed the back of her hand on Emma's forehead, and she told Emma she was burning up and suggested she go home and rest. Emma nodded and then stood and slowly shuffled around the bleachers to pick up her backpack. She dug out her phone from inside and then called her mom and then told her she wasn't feeling good and needed to come home early. When Emma's mother arrived, she felt her daughter's forehead and saw she was burning up, so she drove Emma right to their family doctor. The doctor took Emma's vitals and discovered she definitely had a fever, with a temperature of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. So she was sick for sure. He tested to see if Emma had strep throat, a common illness among teenagers, but the test was negative. After reviewing her charts for a few minutes, the doctor explained to Emma and her mother that Emma probably had a fast-moving viral infection. He told her to go home and rest and that her symptoms should clear up in a couple of days. Emma was glad to hear that it wasn't anything serious. She didn't want to miss a lot of volleyball practices. But when Emma woke up the next day, she felt more tired than she ever had in her whole life. It was like her limbs just didn't want to move, and her lungs could barely take in any air. Emma cried out for her parents, Janet and Martin, and a few seconds later they ran into Emma's room, and the second they saw how sick Emma looked, they told her, "We're going to the emergency room right now." During the 25-mile drive to the hospital, Emma struggled to breathe. By the time they finally arrived, Emma was gasping for air as hospital staff helped her out of the car and onto a gurney. As a nurse wheeled Emma into a room, her mother squeezed her hand and her father followed close behind. The nurse's soft voice was very comforting as she asked Emma questions, but Emma struggled to answer even simple ones like where did she go to high school. Emma vaguely felt the prick of a needle in the crook of her elbow as the nurse attached an IV and drew several vials of blood. Then the nurse placed an oxygen mask over Emma's nose and mouth and picked up a phone. Emma could hear the seriousness in the nurse's voice. She wondered if maybe this was just how nurses sounded in the ER, or maybe this was something really bad. A few minutes later, the nurse wheeled her gurney to a room down the hall and positioned a large X-ray machine over Emma's chest while she lay there. Emma knew that the X-rays could not actually hurt her, but as the machine began to click and hum, Emma really started to feel terrified. What was wrong with her? When the nurse wheeled Emma back to her room after the X-ray, she turned down the harsh overhead lights and told Emma to rest while they waited for the results. Emma was grateful for the peace and quiet. She closed her eyes and immediately sank into a deep sleep. An hour later, Emma was startled awake as a doctor wheeled in a computer and dimmed the overhead lights, pulling up a digital image of her chest. Janet and Martin, Emma's parents, stood up from their chairs in the corner of the room as the doctor began to point to all these dark, cloudy spots on the image. The doctor told Emma and her parents that the grayish cloud on her lungs indicated a severe case of pneumonia. The doctor explained that they could treat the pneumonia with drugs, but the big question was what caused Emma's lungs to become so infected. It could be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or something else. Hopefully more tests would help them figure it out. But the doctor said that this small regional hospital was not equipped to run those type of tests. He was arranging for Emma to be transferred to the Sanford Medical Center in Fargo, North Dakota, almost 100 miles away. It was the closest hospital with a pediatric intensive care unit. Emma grabbed onto her mother's hand as an orderly came to wheel her into another ambulance. Volleyball practice suddenly seemed very far away. About 2 hours later, a physician at Sanford Medical named Dr. Sherry Richards rushed down the busy hall in the pediatric ICU and into Emma's room. Emma's mom sat next to her sleeping daughter, brushing hair out of Emma's face, while her father sat in the corner, anxiously bouncing his leg. Dr. Richards introduced herself to the parents and then walked up to examine Emma. And right away she noticed Emma had very shallow breathing and bluish lips and fingertips, and then she gently touched Emma's hand and it was cold. These were all symptoms of Emma's pneumonia. Dr. Richards smiled at Janet and Martin and told them she was going to prescribe powerful antibiotics to suppress the infection in Emma's lungs. Now, she wasn't sure exactly what was causing the infection, but these antibiotics covered a broad spectrum of disease-causing agents, so hopefully the drugs would help Emma start to feel better, while Dr. Richards continued to look for more specific answers. But the next morning, less than 48 hours after Emma initially felt ill, her condition only seemed to be getting worse. She had an extremely high fever, and her breathing was shallow and rapid, and so very little oxygen was reaching her bloodstream. Dr. Richards needed to do something drastic. She asked Emma's parents for permission to place Emma on a ventilator, a machine that forces air into the lungs when someone is struggling to breathe. Emma would need to have a tube inserted through her windpipe so enough air and oxygen could reach her lungs. Her parents hated the idea, but watching Emma gulping for air, they told the doctor to do whatever it took to help their daughter. Dr. Richards checked in on Emma every day, hoping that with more oxygen, Emma's lungs would get better. But even with the help of the ventilator, Emma wasn't recovering. Emma's heart and other organs were not getting enough oxygen to function properly. Dr. Richards was perplexed. She said to a nurse how incredibly rare it was for a young, athletic high school student to be put on a ventilator. Sudden respiratory failure like this did not just happen out of the blue. The most likely cause for what was happening to Emma would be some kind of viral or bacterial infection, but Dr. Richards thought that was unlikely for one simple reason. None of her schoolmates were getting sick. It was just Emma. So Dr. Richards took a closer look into Emma's patient history to see if there was anything about her on an individual level that could spark any clues. By all accounts, she seemed like your average teenage girl whose only regular medication was a very common acne treatment, meaning it was extremely unlikely that Emma's current condition was caused by a rare side effect from this acne treatment. Also, Emma did not have any relevant allergies either. So, to cover all her bases, Dr. Richards ordered a wide range of tests. She wondered if maybe the respiratory issues were caused by a blood clot in Emma's lungs, or maybe she had undiagnosed rheumatoid arthritis that scarred her lungs. But every test Dr. Richards ran on Emma just came back negative. Dr. Richards was totally stumped. And so she suspected that whatever was happening to Emma had to be extremely rare. It was so uncommon she couldn't find any existing records of similar cases anywhere, which also meant she couldn't find a way to treat it. It quickly became obvious that the ventilator was not enough to stabilize Emma's breathing. After a few days, Dr. Richards switched her to a more powerful ventilator that pumped even more air into her lungs, but even that was still not enough. There was only one option left, a very powerful machine that is normally reserved for patients on the brink of death. A team from the famed Mayo Clinic flew to Fargo with a high-tech, refrigerator-sized device known as an ECMO machine. All the blood in Emma's body would now circulate through this ECMO machine, which essentially takes over the job of her heart and lungs. The ECMO machine required surgery to insert all the thin plastic tubes into Emma's body, and her mother immediately gave permission to do the surgery, knowing this could be Emma's only hope. As soon as Emma's surgery was done and she was successfully hooked up to the ECMO machine, Dr. Richards arranged to fly her back to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. There, Emma would be under the care of specialists who had experience treating patients who were as critically ill as Emma was. But this also meant she would now be 400 miles away from her home. As Dr. Richards watched the team roll Emma and the giant ECMO machine toward the airplane, she shook her head at the danger her young patient now faced. She was convinced that Emma's heart, lungs, and kidneys were so damaged that they would never function again without the help of this machine. Now, Emma's only hope of getting off the ECMO machine was to get new organs. But the wait for a 3-organ transplant could take months that she might not have. For now, the ECMO was saving Emma's life, but there was a catch. The longer she had to wait for new organs, the greater risk that she would die. Once Emma was settled in at the Mayo Clinic, her new doctor explained the situation to her. She was at the top of the priority list to receive her new organs, but there was no telling how long that might take. Emma fought to keep her emotions under control. In just a few short weeks, she'd gone from the varsity volleyball team to needing a machine to stay alive. It was almost overwhelming to process. But Emma refused to lay back and mope. She was determined to regain control of something in her life. So she told her doctor she wanted to walk. She saw the doctor look at her with amazement. He encouraged her to go for it, but he also gently told Emma that given her condition, he wasn't sure that she could even muster the energy to stand, let alone take a step. And even if she could, she'd have to drag along this massive ECMO machine and all the tubes and monitors that came with it. But as an athlete, Emma was familiar with the importance of a good attitude. She knew she was physically weak, but she was also very determined. With enough time and effort, she was certain she could eventually walk on her own. So Emma asked some nurses to help her sit up and place her feet on the floor. She was so dizzy that her head spun, and she had to lie down again almost immediately. But Emma refused to give up. She tried again the next day and sat on the edge of the bed a little longer. And the next day, she sat for even longer. Eventually, Emma was strong enough that she was able to actually stand up, albeit she had to hold on to her mom for support. And then it wasn't long after that Emma was straight up walking out of her room and standing in the hall without her parents' help. Finally, Emma managed to make it all the way down the 60-foot-long corridor to the hospital chapel. And there, Emma tasted her first solid food since she'd been hooked up to the ECMO machine. It was just a communion wafer, but Emma could not believe how good that dry, stale cracker tasted. One morning, after more than 6 months at the Mayo Clinic, Emma's doctor came into her room to review the latest readout from her ECMO machine. As he walked over to it, he smiled down at Emma, who was in bed tapping on her phone. The doctor felt so bad for Emma because she was in this impossible situation, but he was also very proud of Emma for really handling this situation with grace. She was so optimistic and so positive, even though most people would be totally devastated and depressed. The doctor looked at the numbers from the ECMO machine and had to do a double take. He wondered if he was actually misreading the data. Emma looked up from her phone and asked him what was going on, and Emma's doctor told her that her blood pressure, heart rate, and blood oxygen levels all seemed to be improving. He had no explanation for why this was happening, but given the numbers he was seeing, Emma's organs might have recovered enough to function without the help of the ECMO. Doctors still had no idea what had made Emma sick in the first place, but almost miraculously, she appeared to be getting over it. After more than 6 months on the ECMO machine, the tubes in Emma's body were finally removed and she was officially disconnected from the machine. She never got a transplant because she didn't need one. Her organs had mysteriously recovered all on their own. Finally, on a spring day in 2013, Emma left the hospital for good. She had been in the hospital for a total of 7 months with a mystery disease that had baffled some of the best doctors in the world. Now, Emma could return to normal life as an active teenager. But a dark shadow hung over Emma. The doctors had never figured out what was making her sick. So what was to stop it from striking her again, or somebody else in the future? 2 years later, Emma and her parents returned to the Mayo Clinic for a checkup. She'd been coming every 6 months since being discharged, and so far there were no lingering issues from her mystery disease. Emma cheerfully greeted the medical staff as a nurse led her down the hospital's halls into an exam room. While the nurse took Emma's vitals, she remarked how happy all the staff was that Emma had made this full recovery, but then the nurse's face grew serious. The nurse told Emma that there was actually a 12-year-old girl at the hospital currently being treated for the same bizarre symptoms that Emma had experienced. Her lungs had stopped working and nobody knew why, and just like Emma had been, this 12-year-old was currently hooked up to an ECMO machine while awaiting an organ transplant. Emma was shocked to hear this. She held back tears as the memories of her own time on the ECMO machine came flooding back to her. She wanted to do everything she could to help this girl, and so Emma asked if maybe she could meet with the girl's parents. And sure enough, a couple of hours later, Emma and her parents sat down with the 12-year-old girl's parents in the hospital cafeteria. And over some hot coffee, they compared their respective histories. At first, the two girls' cases didn't seem to actually have that much in common. But then Emma remarked that she hoped this other girl at least didn't have the same skin problems that she, Emma, had dealt with when she was younger. The girl's mom laughed and said that her daughter had acne, but not any worse than any other teenager. The mother said that she was taking some medication for it, but it was an extremely common medication. It would turn out that both this girl and Emma were taking the same acne medication, called Bactrim, also known generically as TMP-SMX. The families would shake hands and go their separate ways, and then unfortunately, the 12-year-old girl would eventually die from the mystery condition. Three years later, in March of 2018, Emma, who was now 21 years old, sat at her desk in her modest one-bedroom apartment, drinking her morning coffee and reading the news on her laptop. She clicked on a headline and her jaw dropped. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was a story about a 16-year-old high school student in Wichita, Kansas, named Z Uwadya. She was an athlete who played on several sports teams, but then her lungs just suddenly stopped working, and now Z was relying on an ECMO machine to survive. Emma couldn't believe the similarities between Z's story and her own. It made Emma also think back to that little 12-year-old girl who died a couple years back. Since then, Emma had heard about another teenager experiencing the same thing, and she too had also taken Bactrim, or TMP-SMX. Emma wondered if maybe Z, this person in this headline, was taking Bactrim as well. For years now, this suspicion about Bactrim had lingered in the back of Emma's mind, and now she was more certain than ever that this common medication was what had made them all so sick. Emma found an email address for the doctor who was treating Z, and she wrote to her immediately. Dr. Jenna Miller, who was caring for Z at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, was catching up on paperwork when her inbox pinged. There was a message from a woman named Emma who said that she'd experienced something similar to Z, and she wanted to know if Z had taken Bactrim, because Emma had taken Bactrim, and so maybe that was a commonality. On one level, Dr. Miller thought it was highly unlikely that such a common drug could cause such a horrific reaction. Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is the 6th most prescribed antibiotic in the entire United States. It's used to treat many different conditions. Then she remembered something. She scoured Z's files to confirm it. For several weeks before Z was admitted to the hospital, she had been suffering from a urinary tract infection. And the antibiotic that she was taking to treat it was Bactrim. Dr. Miller wrote back to Emma and told her that she very well might have just solved the mystery behind Z's condition and Emma's own horrible illness. It turned out all the girls with this mystery illness had taken Bactrim, TMP-SMX, shortly before being hospitalized. And when the doctors examined images of the girls' lung tissue samples, they discovered that they had all suffered the same kind of tissue damage. For some reason, the Bactrim was systematically destroying the cells responsible for breathing. Over the next 4 years, Dr. Miller searched patient records across the country for people who'd suffered inexplicable respiratory failure shortly after taking this drug. They identified 19 other cases, mostly young men and women under the age of 20. 6 had died, including Z Uwadya. No one knows why the antibiotic sometimes triggers this rare lung destruction, but Dr. Miller and her colleagues suspect that in rare cases, people's bodies have a potentially deadly allergic reaction to the drug. Today, Bactrim, or TMP-SMX, is still widely prescribed, but acute lung failure is now listed as a potential side effect. Emma is now 26 years old, and she works as a nurse who cares for patients who've just had heart and lung transplants. Emma knows that because of her reaction to Bactrim, which caused all this damage in her body, she can never be a serious athlete again. She gets winded after climbing a couple flights of stairs. But considering that she very nearly died, she doesn't mind at all. 911, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone. And he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1949, 15-year-old problem child Ken Rex McElroy dropped out of school and moved to a tiny farming town called Skidmore, Missouri. There, he began his life of crime, which consisted primarily of theft. At night, he would drive his truck onto Skidmore residents' property, and he would steal their livestock, alcohol, grain, food, antiques, anything he could get his hands on and that he could sell, he would take. And if the owners ever caught him in the act, he would just raise his rifle at them and tell them to go back inside and never report it to the police or he would kill them. And because Rex was this big 270-pound monster of a man who was known for having a bad temper and for being really aggressive, people generally just did what he asked and his crimes went totally unreported. In the rare instances that victims would report Rex's crimes to police, Rex would begin intimidating them and their family by staking out their houses at all hours of the night, or he would just walk directly up to these victims and he would say, "I will kill you if you testify against me." And if none of those tactics worked, Rex used some of his illegal money to hire one of the very best defense lawyers in the entire state, a lawyer who had famously represented the mob, and he would step in and get Rex off of virtually any charge, including the time Rex actually did shoot one of the owners who caught him in the act. Over the years, Rex would use these fear and intimidation tactics not just to make money, but also to prey on young women and girls. In the 1970s, when Rex was in his 40s, he began stalking a local Skidmore girl who was 12 years old named Trina. After assaulting her dozens of times, Rex learned her family was going to be pressing charges against him. So Rex burned down Trina's family's house and killed the family dog, and then threatened to kill the entire family unless they signed paperwork that would legally marry their daughter Trina to Rex. This would protect him legally in case they pressed any charges against him. After the family finally relented and signed off on the marriage, Trina was forced to come live with Rex at his house, and within 2 years, she became pregnant. After the birth of her child, she took her baby and tried to run away from Rex, and she ran back to her family's new house, and she was hiding there, but Rex tracked her down. He took her and their baby back, and then Rex proceeded to burn her family's house down again, and again killed their new family dog. By the end of the 1970s, Rex wasn't only just the most hated person in Skidmore, he was the most destructive person. He had hurt so many people in town, but it seemed like no one could do anything about it. It was like he was untouchable. Then a single piece of candy changed everything. In 1980, one of Rex's children was at a local grocery store in Skidmore when they were caught stealing a piece of candy. When the shopkeeper asked the child to put the candy back, they refused, and it caused this huge fight, and before long, Rex has found out about this huge fight, and Rex, instead of being upset with his child for stealing, he becomes enraged enraged that the shopkeeper had the audacity to accuse his child of a crime. And so Rex began stalking the owner of the store, a 70-year-old man named Bo, along with the rest of Bo's family. At all hours of the night, Rex would just show up in front of their house with a gun slung across his lap, and he would fire shots into the air. And then during the day, he would walk right up to Bo and he would tell him, "I'm going to kill you." And so Bo and his family knew it was only a matter of time before Rex did become violent. And they were right. In July of that year, Rex showed up at Bo's grocery store with a shotgun in hand, and Bo, who was in the back of the shop loading groceries through the back door, he turns around and he sees Rex walking up to him. They have this heated confrontation where at some point Rex just raises a shotgun and he fires a shot into Bo's neck. Bo was gravely wounded, but he would survive, and Rex would actually get arrested and would be charged with attempted murder. And it seemed like, for once, maybe Rex was actually going to get what was coming to him. But he didn't. The attempted murder charge was lowered to just assault, and he was given 2 years in prison. But he would only serve 1 day in jail before being released on bond. And as soon as he was out on bond, he went right to his house and he got his rifle that had a bayonet attached at the end of it, and he went right to the tavern in the middle of Skidmore, and he began telling anybody who would listen that he planned to finish the job, i.e. he was going to kill Bo, and he described in very graphic detail how he planned to do it, which involved this rifle and this bayonet. Patrons that were at the tavern that saw Rex and heard these claims, they were scared for Bo, and so they left the tavern and they told city leaders about these threats. And so city leaders at this point, they've had enough of Rex, and they decide they're going to host this secret meeting that will not include Rex the following morning. So the next morning comes around, and all these angry residents, they come to this meeting and they begin discussing, how are we going to handle Rex? We can't use police. We can't use politicians. Nothing can be done. So what are we going to do? How are we going to put an end to his reign of terror? And after a while, they came up with a plan. And after the meeting was done, everybody left the town hall, they got their guns, and they made their way over to the tavern where Rex was seen earlier that morning. About 40 of these armed men surrounded the outside of this tavern, and once they were all in place, another smaller group of men that were all armed walked inside the tavern, and they saw Rex sitting at the bar with Trina sitting right next to him. And so these men, they walk up right behind Rex, uncomfortably close, right behind him, and they just stand there with their guns looking at him. And at some point, Rex turns around and sees them, and he's about to lash out and start fighting them, but he realizes he's totally outnumbered, and these men that are standing all around him, they look like they mean business. And so he stands up, he grabs Trina, and he brushes past them, trying to act tough, and he walks out of the tavern. When he gets outside, he's taken aback at this additional group of armed men, which is much larger, who are all standing there just looking in at him. And so Rex at this point becomes visibly frightened, but he grabs Trina and he calmly walks out to his truck, which is parked a little ways out in front of the tavern. He gets in the driver's side, she hops in the passenger side, and Rex lights a cigarette up, he turns on his truck, and he's about to try to drive away when a gunshot rings out, and Rex immediately slumps forward onto his wheel. One of the Skidmore residents runs up to the truck, they open up the passenger side, and they grabbed Trina, who was unhurt, pulled her out, and rushed her to safety. Once she was clear, the other residents with their guns just moved in on the truck, and for 20 seconds they opened fire on Rex. After the shooting was over, nobody called an ambulance. Everyone just stood there and watched as the town bully died. In all, there were 46 witnesses that were there when Rex was murdered, but they all said they had either not seen the shooting or they didn't know who the shooter was. And despite a lengthy federal investigation, none of the witnesses ever changed their stories. And so as a result, no one was ever charged with Rex's murder. Years later, a Skidmore resident, when asked what happened here, they just said, "That man needed a killing." On the morning of March 18th, 1990, a young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this 4-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the 2 night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her, and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her, and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum, who lived out in town, and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up, and he takes Karen, and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway expecting to get to the end of it and look in.
Oh, natuur, jouw hart zo groot. Jij bent de ziel van ons bestaan. De wind fluistert zacht door de velden heen. De wolken dansen in de blauwe lucht. Het woud roept ons met zijn mysterie. De zonsondergang kleurt de horizon. Oh, natuur, jouw praat zo puur. In elke
inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground. And then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was incredibly boring, but Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old, and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk, and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera, looking down at whoever was outside at this door, and he saw there were 2 police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the 2 officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office, and there's a window into the security office, so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, hey, are you working alone tonight? And Rick says, no, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon. And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take and he goes, wait a minute, I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID. And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, why are we being arrested? And that's when one of the officers just says, oh, you're not being arrested. You're being robbed. Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to teach the like button how to drive in your car. And then on the day of their first lesson, show up in an 18-speed transmission semi-tractor trailer truck. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get